Hi there. The topic of
Prison.
seems to be of a lot of public concern recently. There's a growing, shall we say, consensus, or certainly a very popular view in media that mass incarceration, that is, the increasing imprisonment in terms of numbers across the country, which disproportionately affects black and brown people compared to white people, is problematic, to say the least. And so in this video, I want to look at those statistics and see if perhaps we can infer or conclude, given based only on the numbers, that there is perhaps something amiss in the criminal justice system. And just on the face of it, if we look at ratios, imprisonment rates, and aggregate statistics, it's hard to conclude from a graphic such as this, where the United States alone has more prisoners than 194 countries, the United States having 25% of the population of China has nearly one and a half times the number of prisoners as China, and that the United States, whose people are vehement or passionate about their beliefs that America is the freest country in the world and that people are freer there than anywhere else in the world, then this number does not jibe with that statement, considering that countries down on the list, which have fewer number of prisoners total and a lower rate of imprisonment, are those which Americans would most likely consider to be less free. And so, when looking at the situation, we want to think about, well, prison is a place where people are removed from society because they are a threat, or perhaps because society via the government has decided to punish these people by depriving them of their most basic rights and liberties, and by isolating them from society and placing them in the company of people in an environment that is violent, unpredictable, psychologically disturbing, unsanitary, and a place where they're not likely to be rehabilitated given those conditions. So there are a lot of questions regarding why prison is still in 2021 or so the main mechanism by which prisoners are taken out of and then subject to reintroduction into society. We need to concern ourselves of whether or not these are effective controls. And so recently, it's been a wide discussion among academics and interested stakeholders that the U.S. has so many prisoners. And so in this video, I want to look at why people are so concerned about the numbers. And just on the face of it, I think we can infer that this is a stark contrast, that one country which has 5% of the world's population would have 20-some% of the world's prisoners, right? Compared to all of these other countries, 194 countries out of just about 200, 205 or so, have just about as many prisoners. And that people in this country, so passionate about their freedoms and liberties, would turn a blind eye to this deprivation of freedom of liberty. And so, does this suggest that the United States is a more criminal society? Well, I mean, it would have to, logically, if Americans realistically believe that they are freer than all other countries, and also accept implicitly that there are so many prisoners. It would have to imply that America is more violent, more criminal. However, then that would, again, contradict the common belief that Americans are this or that, greater than or better than or something like that. So there's just on the face of it something not quite right. So this is just a bar graph showing the same numbers, same prison populations. And in this one, we see 2.3 million, and this one, nearly 2.1 million. So there are different estimates, and the numbers change every day, certainly year to year. And even the Bureau of Justice Statistics does not give precise estimates. They'll usually estimate to the nearest 100 or so. So if we get within a 5% range, then that's pretty good. Because reporting, there's some lag time between reporting. We're not, the prison system and the criminal justice system don't use blockchain or distributed ledgers police departments don't use the distributed ledger across the country. Perhaps they should, so that anywhere in the country they can know how many prisoners, how many arrests there are at any given time, how many people are released and introduced into the prison system. However, that method has not yet taken hold. And in fact, different jurisdictions have different reporting standards. Some jurisdictions don't report all crimes to the FBI, for example. They keep local records. They're local, state, and federal records and systems to look at in the United States, which makes it unique compared to a lot of other countries. So if we look at the rate, both population size and rate in the United States are the greatest in the world. And a rate of 639 prisoners per 100,000 is remarkably high. And you see El Salvador, Turkmenistan, Palau, Rwanda. Rwanda suffered a horrible civil war not so long ago. El Salvador, a lot of Central American and Caribbean countries, you can infer a lot of violence and perhaps drug trafficking related violence there, right? Thailand is relatively well known for crime, right? So you don't see any other developed countries in this list, any other wealthy countries, certainly not what we consider to be the wealthiest country in the world. So this one is not like the others. Right, looking at a comparison with the EU 27, you can see the United States at 630, even just at 600 prisoners per 100,000, it far exceeds anything in Europe. Turkey, not really Europe, but Turkey reaches the roughly 300 mark, so half. Turkey imprisons its people or has prisoners at a rate of roughly half that of the United States, whereas countries of similar wealth, for example, the UK, are at roughly a quarter or less the rate of the United States. Switzerland, looks like about 75, so that's roughly an eighth that of the U.S., right? Germany, similar. So they're imprisoning their populations at a factor of 8 times less, roughly, than the United States, which raises some flags considering that perhaps some of these countries are not as racially and ethnically and socioeconomically diverse as the United States, the U.S. being far and away the most diverse country in the world. In terms of places of origin, languages spoken, religions practiced, etc. And those all relate to social order and legal obedience. When people come from different places, they just have different ideas of what's correct, living or not. And when people have such wide wealth disparities, they have different rationale over how and why they should or shouldn't do specific things. But still, even if we were to control for all those factors, there is a significant difference here. So the EU 27 on average is imprisoning people at a rate of 1/6 roughly, or we could say maybe 13, 14%, 15% that of the US. And so rates and totals seem outstanding at a global comparison. And the U.S. is unique again. We have a state, local, and federal system. You can see that the state prisons have more than half of the total number of prisons. And this chart is kind of convenient. We've got all of the different causes. Now, there has been a lot of discussion recently of the drug war, and there's been inference that if we ended the drug war, then the prison population problem would just go away, basically. But the numbers don't really suggest as much. So if we've got 1,291,000 state prisoners, we've got 191,000 on drug charges, right? And 45,000 on drug possession. That's been the one that people want to eliminate the most, is mere possession. But that is less than 5% of the total number of prisoners. Not convicted in local jails, this is another part of the problem that has received due attention, right? Or it's very important to look at, well, if the Constitution requires a due process to deprive somebody of their rights and liberty, well, then these people who are not convicted sitting in jail are arguably suffering an abuse of their constitutional rights. If somebody is literally, technically, and practically innocent until proven guilty, well, then these people are serving sentences without being proven guilty. These people are still innocent. Technically, they're innocent, yet they're also imprisoned. So 470,000, that's a significant number of the jail population, some 75%. And that's a significant number of the total population. And so if we were to focus on that part, well, then this would be a significant reduction in the total number of prisoners. However, there are some reasons that these people are in local jails as well. You can see that federal prisons represent a relatively small part of the puzzle here, and then drugs in federal prison, as I'll look at later, represent a larger portion of the federal cases, but they still don't total the number of drug offenses in state cases, and these are about 99% trafficking. And trafficking, think what you will about drug offenses, but trafficking internationally especially does imply some association with violence. We've all seen what cartels do. I like to say Mexican cartels chop off more heads than ISIS. While there might not be violence included in all of these cases, this doesn't represent an enormous part of the puzzle, and it doesn't represent as many cases as we see in state prisons, where only 45,000, which is roughly a quarter of the total number of drug cases are possession. So the drug war alone is certainly not the main issue. So that's perhaps fallacy number one exposed in the recent push for prison reform and criminal justice reform. However, we can see that violent crime is more than half of state prisons. And so that seems to be a big category. Do we really want to release violent criminals? Well, I think we could argue about that. But let's look at some more details here. Looking at those jails again, right? 74% of people are not convicted of any crime. And so we've got violent criminals, property criminals, drug criminals, and public order. Public order includes things like parole violations, weapons, decency, prostitution, drunk driving, immigration, right? Drug trafficking, still, it says trafficking 44,000, possession 67,000, other drug 8,000. So in this analysis, they've got possession as the larger group. And so these people, most likely, they've been arrested, they're sitting in jail, but they'll probably go through some sort of sentence deferment program very often. And as we'll see in later slides, the actual prison population, those sentenced, those convicted and sentenced, possession is not as common as trafficking or sales distribution. And so we can split these up and say, well, obviously if these people are innocent, then they shouldn't be sitting in jail. That's number one. Regardless of what they're charged with, they might not have done it. Now, other statistics show that generally, 9 times out of 10, the police and courts get it right. And so we could, just on the face of it, given the likelihood that the police and courts get it wrong, we could reduce this by a factor of 10%, even 20%. So if we reduce the number in jails by 20%, or the total number of prisons by 20%, just based on a rough estimate of worst case scenario, how many times the police and courts get it wrong, then we're still at 1.9 million, somewhere around there, 1.8 million, which is an incredibly large amount. But this is concerning, given that constitutionally, Americans should be innocent until proven guilty. If they are not yet convicted, those are still innocent, and so they have been, in effect, given a sentence before a trial. Pretrial detention has increased recently since 1991. Looks like that's the last time it was about the same as those convicted sitting in jails, and that gap has widened. Right, worse in the late Bush years. But increased through Clinton, through Bush. Overall number in jails decreased slightly in Obama's presidency, but these are local jails, so federal politics might not actually have anything to do with it. This gap is concerning, and even that there are so many is more concerning because they are not convicted, they're not technically guilty. Now, if we do a comparison worldwide, we don't see the United States cracks the top 10. And so unlike prison rates and prison population totals, the United States is quite far down on the list. Now, these might represent 74% of the people held in jails, but remember, jails are about 30% of the total. So 74% of 30% is less than a quarter. So you can see in Libya, 90% of detainees are in pretrial phases. So it takes a very long time to get to trial in Libya, basically. And by the time they get to trial, they're probably just released unless they've done something terribly wrong. And so that would be part of the strength of the constitutional system in the United States, where that fair and speedy trial, maybe that 180-day rule as they have it across the country, doesn't seem fair and speedy, doesn't seem speedy to people, certainly people who are actually innocent of their crimes. And it might not seem speedy for those sitting in jail, sitting in local jails waiting trial, when they can't afford bail, that they have to wait 6 months just to get a sentence deferment or to get put on probation, or so they're actually serving their sentence before the trial. However, it's better than spending years in prison, years in jail, awaiting a trial which might turn into nothing. Probably the pretrial detention serves as a sentence in a lot of these countries because the court system has various flaws. So why can't people get out of jail when they haven't even been convicted or they haven't even seen a trial? Well, median bail is $10,000. Usually people can post 10%. If they post 10% cash, then that satisfies the bail amount. But if they don't have a job or if they don't have any money saved, they can't post $1,000 even, let alone $10,000. And so the likelihood of their sitting in jail at a lower income is certainly higher. So this is what they call a criminalization of the poor. And so this is the second red flag. First red flag is that the U.S. has so many more prisoners. Second red flag is that we have a pretty high amount of pretrial detentions given the constitutional innocence standard, if in fact that is a thing, and technically it should be. So a second red flag here, poor people stay in those jails more often and for longer. I read one time that in a Louisiana parish, because of the lack of public defenders, some people were sitting in jails far past that 180-day rule. So they were in there for a few years even, which is unconscionable. And that's just because they're poor, because they can't afford their bail, or even 10% of it. And some of them, at least, are innocent. Maybe it's only 10% who are innocent, but last I heard, the American system was supposed to have been designed with the idea that it's better to let a guilty person go than put an innocent person in jail. Now, does that pan out in practice? Maybe, maybe not. Women's incarceration worldwide, you see the United States doesn't rank very highly. Well, I mean, I suppose it's in the top 20, so it's in the top 10%. 9.8% of prisoners compared to 20% in Hong Kong, Laos 13%, Myanmar, Macau, China, Brunei, UAE, Guatemala, Singapore, Philippines, South Sudan, Belarus, Vietnam. Hong Kong is a very high income area, and so I suspect a lot of these are foreigners, perhaps a lot of prostitution. Other than that, Greenland, that's pretty high. Qatar is a rich country. UAE, these are Muslim countries, and so there are different offenses for women also. United States is it's an outlier, still an outlier at 10%. Now, why should we be so concerned that we're putting women in prison at a 10% rate? So we can see just by these numbers, perhaps we can extend our sympathies, but by the numbers, what we can see is that men are disproportionately affected by imprisonment. And that probably means men commit most of the crimes. Typically, gender roles, normative gender roles for women don't include criminal behavior. But we see this same trend, 60% roughly in local jails are not convicted. Drugs, they make up roughly the same percent of state prisons for women. Violent crimes, a little bit less. Property crimes, roughly the same as drugs, even a little bit more. So women are sitting in prison for similar reasons, not nearly as frequently as in Hong Kong or elsewhere. A ratio of roughly 10 to 1 or 9 to 1 men to women. And so we can see that prison disproportionately affects men. Incarceration, however, is just one part of the puzzle. Now we have probation and parole. Probation's when people get out of the local jails or when they get a sentence deferment or when they go through a plea bargain with the court. Parole is when they get out of prison. So there are 2.3 million in the correctional facilities actually in jails and prisons. And then there are all these other people who are caught up in the system. And some people say it's like a revolving door. Once you get caught in the system, then you know it's hard to get out. But the knock-on effects, so that every year this keeps going, and people are getting imprisoned, and some get out, and some go back in. But those criminal records stay around forever, basically. And so 77 million today have a criminal record. That's roughly a quarter of the population. So that is remarkable. That's the third red flag here. Convicted of a felony, that's quite a lot compared to the population too. That's 7% roughly of the population. So that's quite a lot. 77 million have a criminal record though. If 25% or roughly of the population have a criminal record, that is remarkable. Again, this suggests that either the US is an extremely criminal society or we have a fairly overactive or extremely active, aggressive criminal justice system, and I suspect it's the latter, right? So 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you had a criminal record, then you could just go to another state, go to another town, and you'd be a nobody, you'd be unknown. Now, those criminal records are accessible everywhere. So these are basically career death sentences for a lot of people, or it certainly makes it more difficult to get a job when, even though it's illegal to discriminate against somebody with a criminal record in a lot of states anyway, they still do it. That's obvious. And so even anywhere around the world, anybody can pull up a criminal record online now. So these will follow people around forever. So this right here suggests to me that it's an extremely aggressive, somewhat predatory criminal justice system, because I don't think that the American population is uniquely predisposed to criminal behavior. And this is also perhaps an antiquated type of situation, given that criminal records are accessible by the general public from anywhere in the world, and the United States keeps track of and releases those criminal records to the public differently and more commonly than other places in the world. So we got jail. Here's that revolving door. 4.9 million individuals are arrested and booked each year, and every one of them gets an arrest record. Now, a criminal record has three parts. It's got the arrest, it's got the charge, and it's got the conviction. But when most people look at a criminal record, if they see anything, including just an arrest, that red flag will go up for them. They're not likely to concern themselves with guilt or innocence so much as a blemish. So every year, nearly 5 million people get a record or get another record, right? And so, right, people get arrested, they go through the system, they might stay in jail even though they're innocent, and then even if they are proven innocent or if charges are dropped, that record stays around, so that will follow them around forever. Other people stay in the jails until their sentencing date or until their trial date, and they get additional pretrial sentences. Some go to prison, some get released on probation. Some will come out and never commit the crime again or never be caught again. That's the important thing to remember. And then others will come out, continue with a criminal lifestyle, and get caught again and again and again. For example, according to these sources, those with drug convictions are likely to get arrested or for rearrests. For those who are rearrested, people who are arrested and convicted of drug crimes are more likely to offend in the same category. Public order, that's going to be probably mostly prostitution, drunk driving. Property crimes, burglary, theft, larceny. But violent criminals are less likely to offend in the same category. So while we see the strongest and longest sentences for violent criminals, under the premise that we can't release them because they will go out and kill or maim or stab or shoot again, they are the least likely to actually go out and commit those crimes again. Perhaps because the sentences are so long that is a deterrent. Perhaps because they recognize after spending years in a violent prison that violence isn't a good idea. Perhaps because there are circumstances around each specific incident which are not recreatable. I'm sure there are a lot of reasons. So among people going from probation to incarceration, probation meaning they were set out on their own by the court without going to prison. They were in the local jail, and instead of going to prison, they went on probation instead. New crimes, not as common as same sentence, no new offense, meaning they had to perhaps get urinalysis and breath tests, and they failed some of those. Some sort of probation violation that did not result in a new sentence. Right, that's the most common way to go into prison while on probation. For parole, same thing. Revocation of parole. This is violating terms of parole, often related to use of drugs and alcohol. Among adults, including legal substances, alcohol is legal across the country, and marijuana is legal in nearly 40% of states now. So even after they're set out of prison, let out, they have their rights significantly diminished, and that then makes them subject to reintroduction into the prison population. So there's been another push by the Biden administration and in recent years to get rid of private prisons. However, it's important to understand these are just a small percent of all prisons. And perhaps the reason that private prisons were invented is because the state prisons are over capacity. Now I've got 48 states here. I believe Connecticut and Ohio didn't release their populations and capacities. And I've highlighted those that are over 30,000, over 100,000. In a couple cases, California and Texas carry a lot of prisoners. Texas especially, because it's not nearly the same population as California. California's population is much bigger than Texas. But you can see that almost all the states are near capacity in the 90-some% range, high 80s, mid 90s, and then several are over capacity. And so in order to try to take away the cost for the states and relieve some of those capacity problems, undoubtedly. That's what led to private prisons. Now, of course, there are a lot of problems with private prisons because they're not subject to the same oversight. But in my opinion, public prisons some sort of vacation getaway where people aren't raped and stabbed and beat up. Maybe not as much by the guards, but I don't know. It's not unimportant, but it seems like maybe splitting hairs to me that there is an epidemic of rape and gang activity and things among prisoners in all prisons. So while private prisons have their own very unique and troublesome issues, if it is only 10% of all prisons, it's not the most important thing. Now, if we take all of these little things and add them up together, of course, that's going to provide a change that we probably need. But I suppose as far as capacity goes, it could be worse. Maybe states should spend more money to open up more public prisons. Maybe they should just reduce the prisoner population rather than outsourcing to private prisons. Obviously, I'm not in charge of all these things. We're just trying to look at the numbers here. The United States does not rank in the top 20. Right? And you can see all of these other countries have prison populations that far exceed their capacity. Now, it's alarming that Iowa has far more prison, 20% more prisoners than it should be handling. Can you imagine then in Congo where there's 6 times as many prisoners as they should have, right? And so there are a lot of countries that are well over the 200% mark. And so those countries need to significantly reduce their prison populations or open new prisons. And so perhaps the private prison industry has a lot of opportunity worldwide. I say that sort of in jest because this is an uncomfortable issue, obviously. Prison is not something that most people want to talk about at length, and that's probably why we have such an odd prison problem in the United States, because it's out of our control. And given that we're depriving people of their rights and liberties, which we hold so sacred, it's something that is uncomfortable for everybody. And so those perhaps produce those emotional responses on both ends, where people are vehemently opposed to or strong supporters of this law and order, correctional justice, or correctional system and criminal justice system. Now, according to the census, younger people in the United States are more likely to be African American, Hispanic, Asian than older people. Looking at the older population, the percent of white people is higher. White alone, non-Hispanic. Now you can see that the Hispanic race is the one that increased the most among those groups, but all of the racial minority groups increased. And by something like 2048, the white non-Hispanic population is supposed to account for only 49% of the entire population. So there are going to be demographic changes that might put these issues into focus. Then again, maybe not. We'll see. So when we talk about disproportionate jailing, which has been a token or a coin phrase among people talking about mass incarceration, that's what we're talking about. That black people, for example, represent only this 10-12% of the population, yet they represent disproportionately high percent of the prison population. If the prison population were representative of society, then the proportion of each race in society would be represented equally in the prison population. However, we see that among people who are arrested once, for example, just over half are white, whereas about 60-65% of the population is white. 18% are Hispanic. That's close to the ratio of Hispanics to the total population, though I believe it's about 25%. 21% is black. That's at nearly twice the rate as black people are present in society. And as the number of arrests go up, the disproportionality gets even greater. Does that mean that the criminal justice system is biased against black people? Well, there are certainly anecdotal accounts that suggest as much, and there have been some landmark studies by the ACLU regarding stop and frisk procedures in New York and other sentencing, disproportionate sentencing outcomes, especially in capital murder cases, which suggest there is at least implicit bias going on. However, we see that it's not so straightforward by the numbers. There are a lot of factors. So to isolate race as the determining factor is very difficult to do. It requires a little bit of faith that statistics alone and scientific methodology alone can't provide. So again, we look at if the drug war is the main reason that people are in prison. Not really. Among white people, more white prisoners are sentenced on drug charges than are black prisoners. And given the total between black and white is roughly the same, these numbers are roughly the same numbers, number-wise, right? So we can see that violent crime is the most common crime type among prisoners, followed by property, drug, public order, and then other, that's like parole violations and things like that. Immigration offenses, actually, that's probably as common. So black people are more likely to be sentenced for violent crime than for drugs at quite a high ratio. They're more likely to be sentenced for violent crime than property crime. Same with Hispanics, same with whites. Everybody is more likely to be sentenced for violent crime first, property crime second. Hispanics, property crime 12.3%, drug. So Hispanics are more likely to be sentenced for drug crimes than for property crimes, more likely to be sentenced for public order offenses than for than for property crimes. And so there's a slight difference in sentencing behavior, sentencing by crime type among the racial groups. But the trend remains that the most common offense is violent crime. Black offenders are more likely to be sentenced for murder than white and Hispanic offenders. White offenders are more likely to be sentenced for rape or sexual assault than the other two categories. Black offenders are more likely to be sentenced for robbery, aggravated assault. Hispanics are more likely to be sentenced than the other two racial categories. Now, this is an interesting statistic here. Black offenders sentenced for robbery. I assume that robbery and burglary and larceny are all very similar charges, except robbery, given that it's violent crime, includes brandishing of a weapon at a convenience store, for example, or a mugging, for example. And so the difference between larceny, burglary, and robbery is fairly slim in a lot of cases. And so there is some potential that white people convicted of burglary or larceny could have been convicted of robbery, and vice versa. Black people convicted of robbery could have been convicted of burglary and larceny, given a more sympathetic DA or somebody who perhaps did not have an implicit bias. But we'd have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. That is merely a guess that's not founded in these numbers. And I have no evidence to suggest that's absolutely true. Fraud is definitely more of a white person's game, right? And I think we can imagine a white-collar criminal. He's most likely white, right? Weapons charges. Black people and Hispanics are more likely than white Americans to be charged on weapons. And given the Capitol protests where white men stormed Capitol buildings, brandishing firearms, I think we can infer that there's something a little bit odd about that. Nonetheless, let's look at federal prisons. Drug offenses are very common in the federal system compared to drug offenses in the state system. So if 15% of 1.2 million people are in on drug offenses in the state systems, I think we saw that was roughly 175,000 or so. A disproportionate number of drug offenses are in the federal system compared to the state system. So nearly half of federal inmates are in on drug charges. At least that was in 2016, and we'll see 2019 in just a moment. So you can see drug category is the largest in the federal system, followed by public order. Violent crime and property crime are state issues, so there are just jurisdictional issues that affect how these different crime types are prosecuted in different jurisdictions. For drug offenses in the federal courts, you're looking at trafficking, international trafficking. Public order is immigration. You're not going to be charging people with drunk driving, except on federal lands. That's going to be uncommon. But decency and speech offenses, weapons offenses are fairly common. The category G is going to include some immigration, some decency, some parole violations. I assume a lot of these are going to be parole violations. And just as we saw with the state cases, the men far outnumber the women at a rate of more than 12 to 1. Whereas racial categories, this is disproportionate to the representation in society, of course, but the total numbers aren't terribly different. Hispanics being lower. So again, white people are represented less in prison than they are in society, whereas black and Hispanics are represented more, and blacks are represented in prisons at a greater rate than both Hispanics and whites in prisons. And the same trend continues in federal prisons, except Hispanics are represented at a higher rate, especially in drug cases, right? And I assume that's a lot of Latin Americans and Mexicans convicted of drug trafficking, which are 99% of the drug cases in federal court. So this statistic by Prison Policy Initiative then raises a flag to me. It says that there are over 1 million drug possession arrests each year. But if we looked at the numbers here, we can see that drug possession is far smaller than drug convictions for trafficking and distribution. And so something is missing. When we see statistics like this, it suggests that that in prison population, possession charges are outsized compared to sale and manufacture, which most of us would think of as the more serious offense, and perhaps even the more dangerous offense, given that firearms are often necessary to protect people in that line of business. So I don't know the underlying statistics and numbers that these people use to come up with this graph. It seems like it's not just arbitrary, they didn't just invent it. But if it is accurate, then this would have to include all those people who get pretrial deferment, who get put off on probation, who don't go to prison, who aren't sentenced on those charges, because even in state courts, where we have more prisoners total than federal courts, even though the percent is less, the number of sentences is twice or more for trafficking and other offenses compared to possession. So whilst this number is somewhat concerning, given its ratio at 1.249 million, that's still a large number of prisoners. If we took out this number of possession charges, that wouldn't seriously reduce the population, right? Or it wouldn't 3.7% would not seriously reduce the population that we would notice, right? Now again, men are disproportionately affected compared to women, as are blacks disproportionately affected compared to whites and Hispanics, given their ratios in society. And as we saw in 2016, similarly, the most common crime types are violent, where black and Hispanics are convicted on murder charges at a greater rate than white defendants. White people are convicted on rape and sexual assault charges at a greater instance than black and Hispanic offenders. Robbery, same thing, and I assume that there's probably something in this. If we looked at every case, we could probably find, maybe not so many percent, but we could certainly find a few hundred anyway. Robbery cases where black people are convicted of robbery where they could have been convicted of burglary or larceny, compared to white people who were convicted of burglary and larceny, there's certainly a few hundred cases where they could have been convicted of robbery. That's just a suspicion. It's not founded. It's just a guess. And so weapons charges, again, something seems amiss here, given that at least in popular media, we don't see black people on the street with assault rifles and carrying on their hips. It just doesn't, something doesn't match there. And so this is probably related to stop and frisk procedures in major cities where black people are disproportionately or perhaps unfairly stopped and frisked compared to white people who may have guns. But given the pictures we've seen in the media, it seems like white people just like to carry their guns out in the open. Looking at federal prisons, very similar in 2019 compared to 2016. Most common offense was drug trafficking. Hispanics were the most common, or among Hispanic defendants, their most common charge by far was drug trafficking. Public order, you can see, is the second, same as before, followed by violent and property crimes, which are not really in federal jurisdiction unless they occur on federal land. Men are disproportionately affected compared to women. Black people are more affected than white people and Hispanics combined. Looking at 2020 FBI Uniform Crime Report, we can see that white people are most likely, if a victim is white, they're most likely to be victimized by a white offender. Male offenders outnumber female offenders at a serious rate, and that would explain a lot of the prison population. Black people are most likely to be victimized by black people. People of their own ethnicity are likely to be victimized by people of their own ethnicity. And this BJS, Bureau of Justice Statistics study, shows these same numbers. Among 5,833,000 offenses recorded, this does not include those that are not recorded, and that is another flaw in the data, that we don't really know how many crimes are not reported, especially in different racial groups, different neighborhoods. It seems that some subcultures are more or less likely to report certain crime types, more or less likely to cooperate with police, more or less likely to call the police for various reasons. So given the reported number of offenses, among white victims where there was a white offender, which was 2 out of 3 cases, most common relationships. Among white victims where there was a black offender, which is much less common, less common, and a statistically significant difference compared to white offender, white victim. The black offender is most likely to be a stranger, followed by well-known acquaintance, then domestic. Among white victims with Hispanic offenders, again, statistically significant difference compared to white offenders, white victim. Again, the most common relationship was stranger, followed by well-known acquaintance and domestic. And if we wanted to make some inferences, I think we could make a discussion out of how and why prison sentencing guidelines and public outrage and concern came to be as it is now, given these relationships between victim and offenders, but I'll leave that to the audience. And so we can see black victims with white offenders, again, statistically significantly lower than black victors, black offenders. The difference here being that black victim, white offender, stranger is the most common category. Well, but that's basically the same with white victims. However, this number is only statistically significant at the 90% confidence level. So this is actually not, it's not a statistically significant difference compared to well-known acquaintance. Black victim, Hispanic offender, again, more or less even across stranger and well-known acquaintance, roughly the same as we would see with white offenders. Hispanic victims most likely have an Hispanic offender, statistically significantly lower, white offender, black offender, and then the relationship roughly the same, stranger, well-known acquaintance. So this is the one that's remarkable. White victim, white offender, well-known acquaintance compared to black victim, black offender, and Hispanic victim, Hispanic offender, both more likely to be strangers. So relationship probably influences how police and the public respond to different crime types, but again, that's just a guess. Overall, we can see crime has declined. Crime intra and inter victim, intraracial and interracial victims and offenders, right? So we can see that intraracial, that's victim and offender of the same race, more common in every crime type, and except for robbery, interracial victim, that's white offender, black victim, Hispanic victim, black offender, etc. Interracial. Victim and offender are different races. We can see, except for robbery, they are statistically significantly lower. So this suggests that white people are about as likely to rob somebody who's white, and black people are about as likely to rob somebody who's black, and Hispanic people are about as likely to rob somebody who's Hispanic compared to robbing somebody of their own race, right? But all other crime types, the different races between victim and offenders is less common than same race. So one is most likely to be victimized by somebody of their own race, even though all violent crime types have gone down. And this might correlate to an increase in the prison population since three strikes laws were passed, and since other elements of the Uniform Crime Bill, Omnibus Crime Bill, were passed, including all of the controversial elements which resulted in a lot of the problems we're now talking about. It might be related to increased criminal justice spending. All of this would then suggest that criminal justice has been a success. And so, given the decline, the more than halving of all violent crime, some people are easily able to argue that criminal justice has been a success. And even though, I guess this is through the Trump years, we could blame some of the social unrest on the slight rise, but then fall of violent crime. So it's been roughly flat across 5 years. There are other cultural influences that affect how violent crime rises and falls. In the same time period, between 94 and 15, the economy did quite a lot better. And you can see violent crime rose slightly in the pre-crisis financial crisis years here. Perhaps with home foreclosures, people were inspired to commit acts of violence and robbery more often. But overall, crime has declined. Now, moving away from prison and crime after the fact, let's look at how people are motivated to commit crimes, since we saw a slight increase in black-on-black violence in those financial crisis years when people's homes were being foreclosed upon, especially in the black community where there was predatory lending, so they had a higher foreclosure rate. All right, so people with multiple risks are likely to be poor, unemployed, and have less than a high school education. So education, income, and work situation, that's intuitive, right? So people who are poor and lesser educated are more likely to commit crimes. Now, people don't go out and commit crimes because their situation is great. Obviously, white-collar crime and multi-million-dollar frauds are a whole different situation because those people are living high on the hog and just greedy. But street crime, shall we say, robbery, acts of violence, these are not rational decisions. These aren't acts that are committed because people's lives are going awesome. These are acts of desperation. And so we've seen some recent studies which quote control for socioeconomic variables and find that black and white and Hispanic people commit crimes at the same rate. Now that control is factoring in situations like education, income, and job situation, right? So we can see that among poorer people, or so among jail population, among the incarcerated, they're more likely to be poor. And among the non-incarcerated, they're more likely to have an average or above average income. Right? We see, especially in this lower group here, the number who go to jail far exceed the number who don't go to jail. So if you're very poor, you're more likely to commit crimes. I mean, it just makes sense. You're more acts of desperation. If you are out of a job, you're more likely to sell drugs. If you are poor and hungry, you're more likely to break into a place and try to steal some money or food. If you need to feed a family and you don't have any prospects, you don't have an education, you're more likely to go out and try to take what you need. because you still need it to survive or to have some sort of stability and security in your life, despite the risks that are associated with going out and committing those crimes. And we can see that the risk among uneducated or male high school dropouts, especially in the black community, has risen only over the years. So younger people, this only goes for people up until people who were born in 75 to 79, who are now 40 some years old. And so then these people have actually aged out of crime by now. People who are 40 years and older generally don't commit crimes. So it'd be interesting to see if this line kept going up for people born in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, as we are seeing now. The most common age group among offenders is like that 18 to 25 age group. And so as the years and decades went on, it became more likely that young people would go to prison. And this has a lot to do with prison policy and public policy regarding policing, budgeting for policing, especially in those neighborhoods where it was perceived that crime is higher, even though, again, when we control for variables like income and education, then it seems that crime rates are not significantly different. But when there is little effort put forth in reducing inequality and providing quality education and stabilizing or increasing incomes in those areas, then whether or not we control for those factors later on in a study doesn't really matter, because the absolute situation is that poorer people and people of lesser education are more likely to commit crimes and therefore more likely to go to prison. And it just so happens that, coincidentally, whether by some sort of natural evolution of the social system or by an explicit, intentional bias against black and brown people, that those racial minority groups tend to have lower incomes and lower attainment of education, and thus are more likely to go to prison compared to their white counterparts. Now, if a child's parents have higher education, even just some college, they are less likely to go to prison. Whereas if they're a high school dropout, they're much more likely to go to prison, especially the father. Now, this only goes up to some college. I assume that then it's even a negligible risk if there's college graduation. Unfortunately, high school dropout, that's a tough category, considering that we have compulsory free education in the United States through age 18, grade 12. And then even anybody, if they can manage to get accepted into a university, can borrow money to go to that university now. So there is an element of community influence and personal decision making when it comes to dropping out of high school or finishing only high school, not going to college, which then affects their likelihood of going to prison, probably because of job prospects and income thereafter. And that poses then an intergenerational risk for children of fathers or mothers who are imprisoned. Their risk of going to prison becomes higher. And so as education affects or influences income level, we see also risk behavior is associated with income level. Now, these types of surveys are self-reporting surveys, so we should take these almost with a grain of salt. They tell us something, but they aren't reliable such that we can make concrete conclusions based on them. But generally speaking, we can see that youth from low-income families are more likely to make riskier decisions than youths from middle and higher income families. Now, it stands to reason that people misreport these. Now, a lot of us have taken these surveys before in middle school and high school, and we usually know somebody who lied thinking that the government was spying on them or the school was spying on them or something, or that it wasn't truly anonymous, or just lied to save face, to make themselves feel better, whatever. And that would be an anecdotal account suggesting that these surveys are not entirely reliable. So they give us a rough estimate, a rough guide, and we can see that except for using other drugs like cocaine, which is expensive, or selling drugs, it seems to be high-income families are more likely to sell drugs. Again, not terribly intuitive, but we can let that stand. Quite intuitive that using other drugs like cocaine, which is expensive, would be associated with high-income families. We can see with violent crime, this is really quite different. So the drug questions, given, actually any of them, given the propensity of respondents to misreport intentionally, we should take this with a caveat that it might not be entirely reliable. But since we see the same basic trend in all categories of risky behavior, then we can assume, along with the other data, that low income is associated with riskier behavior and lower education is associated with riskier behavior. And lower education, as we know, is associated with lower income. And we also know that poorer people are more likely to go to prison. Poorer people are more likely to stay in jails because they can't afford their bail. Poor people are more likely to be convicted of a crime because they can't afford defense counsel that will provide a vigorous defense. We're certainly familiar with high-profile cases of black, white, and other people, celebrities and athletes and so on, who have the money to afford good quality legal counsel and then are acquitted or entered into some sort of prison deferment program because of their capacity to afford that legal counsel. And so income, education, and outcomes in the criminal justice system are certainly related. And so beyond all of those reasons why we should be concerned about how unfair the system is then, when it definitely prejudices poor people and thus black and brown people compared to white people, we should at least consider, we can't change how many people, I can't change how many people are in prison, you can't change how many people are in prison. Even we together, it's debatable if we can change any of this. We should, at very least, campaign for or believe in the rights that they would get more humane treatment in prisons, and it might start with a little bit of health tracking, where the World Health Organization, for example, found that of European countries which have far lower rates of imprisonment than the United States, so it's actually probably better than the United States in terms of these statistics here, they don't have enough data on health information, health conditions, whether they're overweight, tobacco, or using intravenous drugs, blood pressure, hepatitis, tuberculosis, HIV. There's not a lot of information there available because once people are thrown in prisons, they're just kind of forgotten about, aren't they? They're out of society, out of the public view, away in their cage, and then only the corrections officers deal with them. And in private prisons, maybe that means they torture them and beat them more often. And in public prisons, maybe that just means they neglect them more often. And corrections officers certainly aren't doctors. Prison system isn't terribly well funded. It costs a lot just to operate them. And certainly we're not paying all of these doctors to do studies and things and care for those people because, well, a trip to prison, as many people would say, shouldn't be a free trip to the clinic or something like that. So the World Health Organization says that people are deprived of their freedom. They should not be deprived of their health. And I suppose that is a moral message, one which is reasonable in my opinion. So they need more and better data to ensure a better transition back into society. And this is the question I started off with. Is it intended to be a rehabilitation session, to be a place where people reflect upon their crimes and then prepare themselves to be reintroduced into society? Or is it a place where people are put just to ignore them? And is it intentionally out of control in prisons where people are raped and shanked and beaten and mocked and ridiculed and harassed and subject to all these poor conditions intentionally as punishment? And then if that is true, how can we expect them to be reintroduced into society and have changed lifestyle other than through the fear that it might cause that they don't want to go back to prison? So the World Health Organization ends with improving prison health supports human rights and reduces inequities, right? And I would say prison health includes safety, simple things like trying to ensure that people don't get raped and stabbed and beaten. But this would require that society in general puts pressure on leaders, if in fact it is even possible through democratic means, to reduce inequities in the prison system and criminal justice system. Or if this is a runaway train, then the best we can do is talk about it. Either way, I think that when we're thinking about
Prison.
that, we should consider that these are people, and that a single moment should not or does not define an entire person's living lifestyle or life, and that by focusing on the humanity of the situation, then we can, at least as individuals, if not collectively, come to some sort of better understanding about what is appropriate today and what strategy we should have towards criminal justice going forward, rather than this incoherent sort of unconscious strategy that is just sort of coincidental, picked up from the past and continued on through the present into the future, which by the numbers does disproportionately and in some ways, at least debatably, unfairly affects people of black and brown races or colors or ethnicities more than the majority population, especially since those minority populations generally have lower income and lower education, but lower income being the most important. As we see, lower income white people are subject to poor legal representation and introduction and reintroduction into the prison system similarly. So moving forward, I think that this looks like a pretty good conversation to have, and it's important to rely on numbers rather than personal feelings and sympathies to guide our formal conclusions, right? So many red flags came up in favor of those campaigning for criminal justice reform. One major one that I think might have been disinformation was that the drug war is the number one cause of mass incarceration or increased prison populations. And we saw, just based on statistics from both private and public sources, that's not quite so. In fact, violent crime still accounts for the largest crime type among prisoners. So when evaluating options, it's important to look at the numbers before just kind of jumping on the bandwagon and supporting something that sounds provocative and like worthwhile cause. Okay, thank you.